The day my mother died, the house didn't just lose its warmth, it lost its balance. Everything felt tilted after that, like we were all standing on a floor that might give way at any moment. My father became quieter in public but strangely restless at home. He moved through rooms as if he was searching for something he couldn't name, touching old furniture, opening drawers that had no reason to be opened. I told myself grief changes people, that this was normal, that time would smooth the sharp edges. I was wrong. In the weeks after the funeral, responsibilities fell on me without anyone asking. Bills, paperwork, relatives calling at odd hours, all of it somehow became my job. My father leaned into that. He let me handle things my mother used to manage, and at first I thought it was trust. Later, I realized it was something else entirely. He started depending on me in ways that made my chest feel tight, ways that crossed from shared grief into expectation. He began talking late at night, choosing moments when the house was quiet. He spoke about loneliness, about how empty the bed felt, about how a man wasn't meant to live without a partner. I listened because he was my father and because I was still mourning too. But then his words shifted. He talked about loyalty, about how family should always come first, about sacrifices women make for the men they love. Every sentence felt like it carried a weight meant for me to lift. What unsettled me most was how he compared me to my mother. He said I had her patience, her strength, her way of holding the family together. First it sounded like praise. Then it started sounding like replacement, affected of being asked to replace something that should never be replaced. He would look at me for a little too long, waiting for reassurance, for agreement, for something I wasn't willing to give. I noticed the change in small moments. The way he got irritated when I talked about my own future. The way he dismissed the idea of me moving out as selfish. He framed his needs as emergencies and mine as optional. He didn't say exactly what he wanted, but he didn't have to. The pressure was everywhere, in the silence, in the expectations, in the guilt he wrapped around every conversation point. One evening, he finally said it plainly enough that I couldn't pretend anymore. He told me that after everything he had done for me, after losing my wife, he deserved stability, comfort, and someone who wouldn't abandon him. He said outsiders couldn't be trusted. He said family was safest. That was the moment something inside me hardened. I realized then that grief had become his excuse, not his reason. What he wanted wasn't support, it was control. It wasn't closeness, it was dependence. And in that moment, I understood that if I didn't draw a line, my life would shrink until there was nothing left of it. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't try to explain. I simply listened, memorizing every word, because I knew this was the beginning of a decision that would change everything. After that conversation, nothing felt neutral anymore. Every message carried weight. Every pause felt intentional. I started noticing how carefully I chose my words, how often I reread them before sending, as if meaning could leak through the screen if I wasn't cautious. I told myself I was still in control because nothing physical had happened. But control is a fragile thing when desire has already been named. The guilt arrived quietly. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It showed up in small moments, when my partner talked about future plans, when they reached for me absent-mindedly, when they trusted me without question. I would nod, smile, respond like everything was fine, while part of my mind was somewhere else entirely. I tried to convince myself that honesty made this different, that wanting something didn't automatically make me a bad person. I wasn't sneaking around, I wasn't lying outright. I was just holding something back. My conversations with him grew more personal. Not flirtatious in an obvious way, but intimate in a way that mattered more. We talked about fears, about disappointments we never said out loud to anyone else. There was a sense of being understood without having to explain myself fully. That connection became addictive. I began to look forward to those moments, to the way he made me feel seen without demanding anything from me. And that scared me because I realized how easily emotional closeness can replace loyalty if you let it. When the idea came up again, it was clearer this time. He didn't push. He didn't try to persuade me. He simply asked if I had thought about it. I admitted that I had. More than I wanted to. We talked about boundaries, about consent, about what it would mean and what it wouldn't. He said watching wasn't about ownership, that it was about trust and honesty. I listened carefully, not because I needed convincing, but because his words matched the thoughts I had been trying to ignore. What unsettled me most was recognizing my own desire in this. I wasn't being led or manipulated. I was choosing to stay in the conversation. I was choosing not to walk away. There was something about being seen, about being acknowledged in such an open way, that made me feel alive again. At the same time, I knew that wanting this didn't erase the consequences. Consent didn't make it harmless. It just made it complicated as the possibility became more real. My hesitation changed shape. It wasn't about fear of being judged anymore. It was about knowing that once this happened, there would be no pretending it hadn't. I could already sense the shift inside me, the way I was mentally stepping away from the person I had been before. That realization didn't stop me. Instead, it made everything feel heavier, more deliberate. By the time we agreed on a moment, nothing felt accidental. There was no confusion about what we were doing or why. The decision was quiet, almost calm, and that was the most frightening part. I understood then that the point of no return isn't a dramatic act. Sometimes it's simply the moment you stop trying to talk yourself out of what you already want. The shift became impossible to hide once my father realized I was no longer bending. His tone changed from wounded to threatening, not loudly, but in the quiet way that makes words feel permanent. He warned me that choices have consequences, that families remember betrayal longer than strangers remember love. He said if I walked away now, I shouldn't expect forgiveness later. I listened, but something inside me had already stepped back, watching him as if from a distance. At the same time, my relationship outside the house deepened in secrecy. What started as comfort turned into refuge. I found myself craving conversations that felt normal, affectionate, balanced. With him, I wasn't someone's replacement or emotional crutch. I was wanted for who I was, not what I could provide. That contrast sharpened everything. The more my father tightened his grip, the more clearly I saw how unhealthy it had become. I began lying, not out of malice but survival. I lied about where I was going, about who I was with, about how late I'd be home. Each lie carried guilt but also relief. It was the first time since my mother's death that I felt like I had something of my own again. And yet, I hated myself for it. I had always believed honesty was a virtue. But honesty had become dangerous in that house. One evening, my father confronted me with the truth he had been circling for weeks. He accused me of giving my heart to someone else while he was left alone. He called it betrayal. He said I was being unfaithful to my own family, as if family were a contract I had violated. He didn't need proof. My emotional distance was enough. To him, affection not directed at him was theft. That was when I understood the full extent of what was happening. This wasn't just control, it was possessiveness dressed up as grief. He wanted exclusivity, not support. Loyalty, not love. In his eyes, my emotional connection elsewhere was the real sin. And for the first time, I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I simply said that I was allowed to love and be loved without permission. The silence that followed was heavy. He looked at me like a stranger, like someone who had crossed an unforgivable line. In that moment, I felt something break cleanly. The fear that had kept me rooted there loosened its hold. I realized that no matter what I did, I would be the villain in his story unless I surrendered completely. And I wasn't willing to do that. That night, I made my decision final. I packed what I could without drawing attention. I left behind objects that held memories because I knew memories could be carried without permission. When I stepped out of the house, I expected to feel devastation. Instead, I felt grief mixed with freedom. Grief for the father I thought I had, and freedom from the role he had forced me into. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know how society would judge me, how family would talk, or whether my choice would cost me more than I was prepared to lose. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Staying would have meant betraying myself, and leaving was the only honest thing I had done since my mother died. The aftermath didn't arrive loudly. It crept in quietly, the way regret always does. When the night finally ended and I was alone again, the house felt unfamiliar, like it no longer belonged to the woman who lived in it. I sat in the silence, replaying everything again and again, searching for a version of the story where I could remove myself from responsibility. I couldn't find one. By morning, the weight had settled fully in my chest. Nothing around me had changed, yet everything felt different. I moved through routine like a stranger, making tea, checking my phone, answering messages with practiced calm. When my husband called later that day, his voice sounded warm, trusting, unchanged. I responded the same way I always did. And that familiarity hurt more than anger ever could have. He asked how my night was. I told him it was fine. That lie came too easily. That scared me. The days that followed were worse than the night itself. Memory doesn't fade just because you wish it would. Every quiet moment gave my mind room to wander back, to question what it meant about me, about my marriage, about the choices I thought I would never make. I watched myself closely, wondering if something about me had been permanently altered or if this guilt was proof that I was still the same person who cared deeply about right and wrong. There were no dramatic confrontations. No sudden exposure. The world didn't collapse the way stories warn you it will. Instead, I lived with a private fracture no one else could see. That was the punishment. Carrying something that heavy while pretending nothing had happened required more strength than I expected, and more dishonesty than I wanted to admit I possessed. I avoided his friends after that. Distance became my only defense. Every message I ignored, every invitation I declined, was an attempt to build a boundary I should have enforced sooner. They didn't push. Maybe they understood. Maybe they carried their own version of guilt. We never spoke about that night again, and that silence became another secret layered on top of the first. What stayed with me most wasn't the act itself, but the realization of how quietly betrayal can grow. It doesn't always begin with desire. Sometimes it begins with exhaustion, with feeling unseen, with allowing small permissions to stack up until saying no feels harder than saying yes. I learned that loyalty isn't tested in dramatic moments. It's tested in quiet ones. When no one is watching, I still love my husband. That truth never changed. But love alone doesn't erase choices. It doesn't undo moments you can't take back. It only asks you to live honestly with who you've shown yourself to be. I had to confront parts of myself I didn't like. Parts one had ignored because they didn't fit the image I tried to maintain. I don't tell this story for shock. I tell it as a warning. To myself and to anyone listening. Boundaries matter long before they're crossed. Loneliness deserves attention before it turns into justification. And trust, once placed in your hands, is easier to break than it is to repair. That night didn't ruin my life. But it changed how carefully I walk through it now. Because I know what one unguarded moment can cost, and how silently it can happen.